Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you so much for having me. Really happy to be here. As Sophia said, my name's Olivia. I'm a member of Portland DSA. Um, I also work as the North America coordinator for the BDS movement. And I actually got involved in BDS organizing through DSA. So I'm really happy to be here today and kind of make these links between our socialist movement and the movement for justice in Palestine, because, I truly believe that we cannot end the injustices of apartheid and occupation without also ending the injustices of capitalism. So I'm just going to start by kind of giving you like an overview of what BDS is. I think, we're all probably familiar with the acronym BDS. We know that we support it as an organization, but I feel like it's helpful to really get into just the basics of it. So Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions is a set of tactics that was called for by 170 Palestinian civil society organizations, so trade unions, women's organizations, grassroots organizations, et cetera, in the struggle to achieve freedom, justice, and equality. These tactics of boycotting, divesting, sanctioning have a really long history in struggles for justice around the world, including, the civil rights movement in the US. And Palestinians aim to employ them to end international complicity in the Israeli regime of occupation, apartheid, settler colonialism. As I'm sure many of you are aware, especially if you organize around this or you've attended other events, Israel is occupying and colonizing Palestinian land, discriminating against Palestinian citizens of Israel, and denying Palestinian refugees the right to return to their homes in violation of international law. So the BDS call is inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, and it urges action to pressure Israel to comply with international law. BDS call was issued in 2005, and now BDS is obviously this huge global movement for Palestinian rights that's made up of unions, academic associations, churches, and really big grassroots movements across the world. So BDS is an explicitly nonviolent movement. The civil society organizations that put out the BDS call have chosen to utilize nonviolent tactics to address the violence of Israel's system of domination. And these tactics have been used really effectively, even despite attempts to ban or criminalize BDS. Boycotts are obviously recognized as a form of political expression protected by the First Amendment. So BDS calls for boycotts, which include consumer boycotts, like boycotting certain products, cultural boycott, sports boycott, academic boycotts, divestment, meaning withdrawing investments from corporations involved in Israeli oppression, and sanctions, meaning government sanctions on Israel. And these tactics are used to achieve three clear goals. So there are three goals of the BDS movement. Number one is an end to Israel's occupation of all Arab lands and dismantling the illegal apartheid wall. Number two is full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And number three is the right of return for Palestinian refugees. So those are the three demands of the BDS movement. The BDS call is it's not an open-ended boycott of Israel, but it's something that will remain in effect until these Palestinian rights are fulfilled. So you can think of it like a picket line. In DSA, we do a lot of labor organizing. We would never cross a picket line if workers were out on strike. We wouldn't shop there or do business there until their demands were met. And you can think of BDS the same way. The BDS call is built on anti-racist, universal human rights principles. And the BDS movement doesn't specify whether the solution should be one state or two state, but rather that any solution must fulfill these basic rights of the Palestinian people in order to be just and sustainable. We can go to the next slide, I think. Yeah. So there are a couple different reasons why BDS is an effective strategy. The first, I would say, is shifting power. I think BDS has really fundamentally transformed the international solidarity movement for justice in Palestine. I think it's kind of shifted power from this impotent peace process dominated by political elites and all these complicit states to this big mass movement. And that has really been able to take us from sympathy to action. So rather than just, we put out a lot of statements of solidarity with this cause or that cause, But this kind of moves us from that symbolism to like tangible action we can take in the form of campaigns, which is really exciting. Instead of just kind of being like helpless or, that stuff's happening over there, nothing we can do here, kind of puts the impetus on all of us to end the ways in which our communities are directly implicated in Israeli violence. So with BDS campaigns, we're not like waiting for change to come from the top. We can force this change in international support for Israel ourselves by forcing an end to complicity wherever we can, which is pretty cool. BDS also forces like allies, those of us who are allies to the Palestinian cause, to be accountable to this huge breadth of Palestinian organizations that have called for this. This is a call from Palestine, and we are answering it as the international community. So in that way, I think our solidarity really grows from the demands of Palestinians rather than a sort of like colonial mentality of like knowing what's best for Palestinians. We're answering the call. Educational impact is also a big part of it. For those outside of Palestine, I think BDS takes something that's happening across the world and really localizes it so it can't be ignored. As I'm sure many of you know, BDS can create controversy, and that garners media attention and kind of forces people to learn more and take a side on a campaign that might directly affect them. Kind of helps us who are working on these campaigns tell the story of what is happening in Palestine, and kind of changes the discourse by focusing on the specific complicity and actions of our institutions. So even campaigns that might not like be a win in reaching their ultimate goal are sometimes just like really successful in building that awareness around Palestine. And last but not least, we do BDS campaigns because they work. So they have an impact in addition to, bringing this media attention, changing the discourse, educating around Palestine. There's been this snowball of BDS victories with actual economic and political impact. And, it gives us a way to actually take the profit out of occupation. I think we can go to the next slide. So there are a lot of different kinds of BDS campaigns to choose from, and you can choose the most like strategic and achievable targets in your own local context. But campaigns can include a municipal boycott. For example, a city might end a contract with G4S. Academic boycott, so a university or academic association ends institutional collaboration with Israeli academic institutions, so like research partnerships, that kind of thing. Sports boycott, so for example, a US team might refuse to play against an official Israeli team, or Israel gets suspended from FIFA. Consumer boycott, so for example, a church can declare itself Pillsbury free. We have a boycott campaign against Pillsbury right now, meaning the church is not going to buy any Pillsbury products, or a co-op might deshelve Israeli products. There was one up in Olympia, Washington that did that recently, which is awesome. Cultural boycott, so for example, a celebrity cancels a performance in Israel, or a US event by Israeli cultural ambassadors is canceled. Boycott greenwashing, that's a big campaign happening right now. So protesting an exhibit at a tech or eco conference that kind of presents Israel as like a beacon of environmental progress, which is obviously a tactic that Israel uses to whitewash war crimes and the environmental destruction that occupation brings. Anti-normalization, so boycotting events that are like kind of framed as like dialogue, both sides, to bring together Palestinians and Arabs and Israelis, either people or institutions, without the latter, Israelis, recognizing Palestinian rights under international law and kind of placing as this dialogue's goal resistance to Israel's oppression. Rather than doing that, it's really about like normalizing in both sides. And boycott pinkwashing, so boycotting events that promote Israel as a beacon of freedom for LGBTQ communities. Israel really uses this tactic as like a badge to whitewash apartheid and kind of exploits the struggle to further oppression of Palestinians. And then divestment. Divestment campaigns can include getting your city, your university, your church, your union, your pension fund to withdraw investments in corporations that are complicit in Israeli apartheid, and there are a lot. So something to keep in mind is that BDS is more about collective and not individual action. So more important than keeping your own investments and purchases and consciences clean is working within groups like DSA or in your union or in coalitions to organize effective campaigns and build power globally to support the Palestinian struggle. So you'll often see like lists like you individually should boycott products from this list of like 100 companies. And that's fine if you want to do that, but that's not going to be as effective as a sort of collective action, a group that picks one target and wins that campaign on an organizational or institutional level. And then in terms of picking a target, I think we can go to the next slide. So I think we want to be strategic with the targets we select. The BDS movement doesn't actually boycott every boycottable event or product or institution, because that would make it pretty impossible to achieve concrete results. So to be strategic, we kind of carefully select our targets and how we campaign. In each case, we have like priority campaigns that we focus on and that we recommend to activists. But like obviously, there might be a contract in your city that's unique to your city. And so when selecting a BDS target, we generally recommend considering the 3 following criteria. Number 1 is the level of complicity involved. So the deeper the complicity, the easier it is to mobilize support for BDS action against any given target. So, there are universities that are deeply involved in developing military products for Israel. That would make them great BDS targets. The potential for forming a broad cross-movement coalition against the target. So, for example, like a boycott of G4S, which is a priority campaign right now, makes a lot more sense than boycotting a company that maybe only infringes on Palestinian rights, because G4S is complicit in so many other human rights abuses around the world, not just in Palestine, on the border here in the US, in prisons. It obviously makes it like a target that you can do a lot of broad coalition building around, which is important. And then last is the possibility for success. So even if, you find a target that has high level of complicity, you can form a big coalition around it. We're not going to launch a campaign against a target unless we have a reasonable chance of actually winning. And success can sometimes just mean reaching a wide mainstream audience and winning their support, rather than actually succeeding in canceling an event or a contract. But symbolic victories alone are not really sufficient. So we do BDS because we want to win and to achieve Palestinian rights ultimately, and not to just like win points and feel good about symbolic gestures alone. So only through sustained and cumulative and growing and like mainstreaming successes can BDS actually achieve its objectives, which are freedom, justice, and equality. So that's just kind of an overview of the BDS movement, the types of campaigns, and like how we pick campaigns. I think I'm going to leave it there, and I think we're going to have more of a conversation now.
Thanks, Olivia. That was really extensive, and I think we also feel free to also have a lot more questions that can come in. So now I think what we're gonna do before general Q&A is just have like a facilitated kind of conversation between me and Olivia about just a few things to kind of maybe shape the conversation a little bit. So with my first question I have is, how can other DSA priority campaigns incorporate BDS into our existing demands, like labor organizing, electoral work, housing, police and prison abolition, eco-socialism? I don't know if many people know, but at the COP26 talks, the kind of official Palestinian delegation couldn't even get visas to go to the talks. So when we're thinking about just everyday infringements on solidarity and our rights to actually build this new world. And then can you give an example of successful ways DSA members have been able to connect issue-based work to Palestine, and kind of what what would be maybe good examples for us here in PhillyDSA?
Yeah, I think something we say a lot as like sort of a slogan on the left is that all of our struggles are interconnected. I say it all the time, but it's really true. I was just watching coverage of COP26, and there was a climate activist talking about Palantir, because Palantir, it has a really deep relationship with BP, but also ICE uses Palantir for deportation operations. US police use Palantir for predictive policing. And Palantir also provides that like predictive policing system to the Israeli military to use for surveillance of Palestinians. So these are the kinds of fights we are up against. And as socialists, I think we kind of recognize that these like capitalist giants who are putting people before profit are harming us in all these different connected ways. In terms of how BDS relates to DSA's like priority campaigns, I think especially with labor, which obviously, organizing the working class is the #1 priority for us as a working class organization. I don't think it's possible to achieve like real serious BDS wins without an organized militant and internationalist labor movement. And similarly, I don't think it's possible to win in the labor movement without being truly intersectional and internationalist and extending that solidarity to our brothers and sisters worldwide. So in so many other countries, obviously the labor movement is a lot stronger than in the US, and the labor movement has been absolutely key to BDS. There's so much trade union support around the world. And we're starting to see some of that in the US too, with dock workers at ports across the US recently honoring the Block the Boat picket, which was a picket to block the Israeli Zim ships from docking and unloading. The San Francisco Teachers Union endorsing BDS, that was huge. And that came from a caucus, my understanding, inside that union that included DSA members. Right now in Oregon, we found out that our state employee pension fund is the largest investor in the private equity firm that owns NSO Group, which is the Israeli spyware company that has been in the news for like hacking phones of politicians and journalists and human rights activists. And so that means that all these union workers' pensions in Oregon are going to this Israeli spyware company. And I was just meeting with a teacher who wants to take this through her union, which actually has endorsed BDS here in Oregon, which is exciting. They haven't made it public yet, but they want to take it to the state level and make sure that they divest from this private equity firm. When we talk about housing, like that's a big DSA priority campaign too. Airbnb profits from vacation rentals in illegal settlements. There was a big controversy about it. Because they actually said they were going to pull out, and then they got so much backlash. They were like, no, never mind, we're not pulling out. And they're also, a huge driver of displacement and gentrification here in the US. When we talk about police and prison abolition, so much of the military security system is linked to Israeli state violence. Tactics are shared between US police and military and Israeli police and military. Weapons are tested in Gaza before being used on protesters in the US. There are very tangible links that we can make with BDS work and with our priority campaigns. And you can also really tailor it to your local context. We did a really fun campaign here in Portland as PortlandDSA, where the Portland Trailblazers had this partnership with this sniper scope company, Leupold and Stevens. They did this big thing at every Trailblazers game to like honor a hometown hero. And it was like the sniper scope company also was providing scopes to the Israeli military during the Great March of Return. Like you could see these scopes in pictures that were being used to murder Palestinians. And it was also like all over the Blazers stadium. So we ran a really fun campaign. We got like a veteran nominated for hometown hero, and he like took a sweatshirt off and had a shirt on that said end this sponsorship. Made a lot of news. We actually won that campaign because they did end the sponsorship. So that was just like an example of, tailoring it to your local context. And we also like really built up our veterans caucus through that campaign. I'm also really encouraged to see DSA elected officials like Cori Bush, like Zahran Mamdani, really serve as like a model of what it means to be a DSA elected and like strongly upholding our organizational principles in their elected office. And I just also want to plug that the National BDS and Palestine Solidarity Working Group has resources for electoral working groups. We have like sample questions for candidate questionnaires. We have resources to educate candidates. So please reach out if you have an electoral working group in Philly, or if you're from another chapter and you're interested in learning more about that.
Thanks, Olivia. That's like just really exciting to hear as well. And we are kind of starting to get into electoral season here in Philly. So that is just something for us to be like aware of. I guess this also comes back, to another question I wanted to ask of what you think are some of the most impactful BDS victories that we've had, and maybe like just important lessons to get from them, whether they're like good or bad.
Yeah, there have been so many amazing BDS victories over the years. I think, there have been really huge wins, like multinational corporations like Veolia and Orange have pulled out of Israel following BDS campaigns. Ireland voted to ban settlement products. There are bills in other parliaments that are proposing the same thing. Lots of city councils globally have voted to join the BDS movement in some way. In the US, several city councils have voted to divest from corporations that profit from occupation, including here in Portland, actually, a couple of years ago, voted to divest from Caterpillar, along with like a bunch of other corporations. Thousands of artists and musicians have boycotted Israel. Michael Bennett led a delegation of like several NFL players to like refuse to go on a delegation to Israel. There have been lots of actors who have passed on free trips, lots of wins on campuses and academic associations. Major churches, investment funds have divested. The Presbyterian Church, which is huge, the United Methodist Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church have voted to boycott settlement products or have divested from companies profiting from the Israeli occupation, which is huge because churches are actually like some of the most powerful divestment campaigns because churches are massive and their investments are massive. There have been, like I mentioned, the Block the Boat action, I think was really inspiring and impactful. For me, I think, there are all these different kinds of victories. For me, some of the most important lessons learned from BDS campaigning, especially as socialists, is that labor and workers can't be an afterthought. It's very necessary to have organized labor when possible, be part of BDS campaigns. Something we learned from an unsuccessful campaign here in Portland, we had a campaign to stop the city contracting with G4S. The city has a contract for G4S security guards at City Hall. And we were told, if they don't contract with G4S, the workers would keep their jobs and it would just be under a new contractor. And city council was like really supportive and they were like really horrified about everything we told them about G4S. But we ended up losing the vote because the union that represented these workers came out against it. So failing to really get the union on the same page was a big weak spot for us in that campaign. So I think when doing BDS campaigns, like it's really important where you can to have like labor not be an afterthought, but like an integrated component of your campaign.
Yeah, that is, I think, just a general lesson for us in so many of our struggles right now as we deal with, like divesting from police and prisons, a just transition to renewables and things like that. So I feel like as socialists, who do prioritize the working class, this is like really why it's so central for us to be involved in BDS and bring in that analysis. Another question I had that I know that other members brought up last week, if we could talk a little bit more about why the BDS movement has just historically not taken a position on one state or two state in Palestine. If you could maybe elaborate more.
The short answer is it's not our job. That's not our mandate as the BDS movement. BDS focuses on the realization of the three basic rights that I mentioned before and the implementation of international law. The BDS movement is led by the broadest Palestinian coalition, which is the BNC, the BDS National Committee, which is based on the BDS call. And so the BNC can't agree on a political agenda beyond the common BDS denominators, and it's not required to. Like the BNC is not the political leadership of the Palestinian people. It only leads the BDS movement. So I think by avoiding like any particular political formula, the BDS call just insists on the necessity of including these three basic rights in any just and legal solution. So it really helps like present a platform that not only unifies Palestinians everywhere, but also appeals to international civil society and these grassroots movements by evoking these sort of universal principles of freedom and justice and equal rights that were also upheld by the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, civil rights movement in the United States, all these movements that we can point to. So by adhering to this sort of like rights-based agenda rather than like a political solution-based agenda, the BDS movement sort of drags Israel and its lobby groups onto this like battlefield where they're losing. Like the moral clarity of what the BDS movement demands kind of neutralizes Israel in that way. It's more powerful and like harder to refute because we are simply asking for these three basic human rights.
Yeah, I think this is starting to become, just a moot point because Israel's an apartheid state anyway. But I like really hope that it's just easier for us to also be able to, take down that kind of point when people use it against the movement. One question I had as well was this is a question I brought up last week too. But so there's an international effort from different governments to define anti-Semitism as anti-Zionism or equate those two together, which has obviously dangerous kind of implications for what we know to be like protected free speech and the right to protest, the right to boycott, the right to leaflet is protected free speech. But this is an effort to kind of further criminalize free speech on Palestine much more widely, so that a teacher who talks about Palestine can be fired, a campus group can be decertified, and so on, and to the point where it can be considered a hate crime. And we're seeing the worst parts of that reflected in the UK, where the Labour Party has moved so much further to the right after attacking kind of Jeremy Corbyn and the left so much that Palestine has become, people have become more defensive about actually defending Palestine. And we saw that, I think, this past week, where the Israeli ambassador to the UK, there was a student protest against her. And people, in the Labour Party, the Labour right, attacked those protesters and said, actually, it's a violation of her free speech that you're protesting her, instead of saying, actually, protest has always been free speech. So I guess my question is, what are the ways we can organize to maybe stop this campaign in the US? And what are the ways that you're sort of seeing it come out in different places?
Yeah, as you mentioned, a lot of institutions right now are being pushed by lobby organizations to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. That stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, I believe, which is a definition of anti-Semitism that classifies criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. So first I want to say Palestine Legal. If you don't know them, you should. They're an amazing organization. If this is something that is happening to you in your organizing context, definitely reach out to Palestine Legal, because they've been there before. They can provide legal support and resources to fight this. IJV, Independent Jewish Voices, which is a Canada-based organization, kind of the Canadian equivalent of JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace. They've done an incredible job fighting the adoption of the IHRA in Canada, and they have a hub on their website with resources about this, including an alternate definition of anti-Semitism that obviously does not include criticism of the state of Israel in the definition. I also think, though, that we don't want to get so caught up in just defending our right to boycott that we don't do BDS campaigns at all. That's kind of the point of these fights, is to weigh us down in just defending our rights that we don't even like campaign at all. And I honestly think that, you know, these kind of attacks are losing some of their weight, honestly. I think people are seeing Israel for what it is, which is an apartheid state. You know, 2021 was a huge year for mainstreaming this word apartheid and the apartheid analysis. And naming that is not anti-Semitic. And the people who are pushing for these adoptions of this definition and more broadly anti-BDS laws that have been passed at the state level, they're fighting a losing battle. Like, I think we need to remember that we're the ones winning right now in that fight. In every US state where anti-BDS laws have been passed, they have been challenged and eventually overturned because they are blatantly unconstitutional. So I would say there's a lot of precedent for fighting this, and it's a losing battle for those who are trying to suppress our right to boycott and divest, and you should be confident in that.
Check out Palestine Legal. They do national work. The link is in the chat. And I think that there's like a documentary that recently also came out that features folks on the ground who've been active in the movement, who've been repressed. Yeah, just to kind of learn the lessons of the struggles right now. The last question I have before turning it to, you know, just a general Q&A is, so in the mainstream media, there's this what's been seen as sort of Trump being a more anti-war candidate because he pushed for more anti-war president because he pushed for troop withdrawals in Afghanistan and Iraq. We obviously know that's, you know, much more distorted idea because there's U.S. forces on the ground everywhere, and drone warfare is the new kind of frontier of empire in so many ways. But his most lasting legacy, I think, when it comes to also Palestine, is just how quickly his administration pushed and gave cover to normalization deals between different countries in the Middle East and Israel, something that was like, you know, taboo to do openly and express because there's been such historically always been mass pro-Palestine sentiment in the region. But so, you know, this came through, you know, not only did Trump, you know, support the Saudi war in Yemen and Sisi's dictatorship in Egypt, really crushing people's ability to actually resist, but also having Jared Kushner as his Middle East envoy and really pushing what was known as the Abraham Accords that would, you know, have like deals with Gulf countries in Israel and countries like Morocco. And so you sort of have a new situation now that the Biden administration is not going to roll back because they support greater cooperation and collaboration between Israel and these other countries. And what we're seeing is like more economic and cultural and military exchanges between Israel, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, Sudan, and Morocco. And many of this is also aligning with the interests of these governments in repressing their own people and being able to use Israel as a way to do that. So this is obviously a huge setback for the local BDS movements in these countries. And it's a historically unprecedented really moment for the people of those regions. Like seeing every day, like new student exchanges between like, you know, Kuwaiti students going to Israel and being like, this is a great time. I'm in, you know, this university and so on. And in Morocco, where Trump basically recognized Morocco's sovereignty over colonized Western Sahara, really allowing the king to kind of like continue to repress the people of Western Sahara. And so my question is, you know, we're seeing a huge, you know, like our movement gaining ground in the US at the same time as this is happening. What in your mind, like what in your opinion is the way for us to also support those movements, given they're facing a really different scenario right now?
Yeah, I just want to cite the most authoritative Arab public opinion poll in 2020 from the Doha Institute shows that 78% of Arabs consider Palestine the Arabs' main cause. Like that is very much still, you know, a unifying cause among people. But there are obviously for sure some challenges facing BDS organizing work in the Arab world. One of them, as you stated, obviously several Arab dictatorships, the UAE, Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, Egypt, Saudi Arabia to an extent, have really openly betrayed the Palestinian cause, which is like making it much more difficult for us to grow BDS campaigns like among civil society, even though there is, you know, this broad support among civil society. The BDS movement was also like sort of late in realizing that like even in the Arab context, our global intersectional approach is still really needed, like connecting Palestinian liberation with domestic struggles for freedom and democracy, as well as social and economic justice. And long-term like strategic campaigning is not like as common in the culture of struggle in the Arab world as it is in the US, South Africa, India, the UK, and elsewhere. So like given that context, it's really important to not mistake the normalization of relations with Israel by these regimes in the Arab region as indicative of decreasing support for Palestinian liberation. That's not the case. I would say for us in the US, we should just be strengthening our commitment to global justice and internationalism in general, and our commitment to ending US imperial wars and US support for these regimes in terms of military funding, et cetera. And also just intensifying BDS campaigning, including intersectional BDS campaigns that involve Arab partners. So we have some Arab BDS groups involved in our global G4S campaign right now, for example, that I work with. And I think that can really help us support and build ties with our comrades in Palestine and in the entire Arab region.
Great. Thanks. It's so actually really exciting to hear about the G4S campaign too. So now I think we're going to pivot to just also general questions from everyone else. I see we have at least one question now. You know, feel free to collect your thoughts and get them out there in the chat. Cooper said if you could say a few words about ending U.S. imperialism. How can you say about resisting institutions that support U.S. imperialism, i.e. through military spending, since Israel is an essential base in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like what DSA can do, I'm really excited that we have such an amazing international committee. We have the DSA BDS working group. We have, I believe, a National Veterans Caucus. I know we have a Veterans Caucus in Portland that is really active. We have an anti-imperialist working group here in Portland that we've done a lot of work in terms of not just BDS work, but also, you know, we've had guests from Venezuela come to our general meetings. We've done campaigns around Iran and the Philippines. And I think as a socialist organization, I think we really have an opportunity to be a leader in our communities and really show the ways that like this is a local issue. Because I think people have a tendency to be like, well, you know, that's happening over there. We need to focus on, you know, housing, organizing workers, et cetera. It's like, we can do it all. We can do all of that and actually integrate it into our campaigns. And I think we've done a good job of that in Portland. So I would love to see like other chapters kind of build up their anti-imperialist working groups and share these lessons in campaigns, because I think there's so much opportunity that can just happen at the local level. I also got a question. I got a private message. I'll respond to that later. Sorry.
Oh, it's not a question? Okay. And I was like, all right. I mean, yeah. If you feel shy about your question too, you can also, I don't know, private message. It's fine. The recording does not show any of the questions if that's your main worry. So we have another question from Kevin. In the late spring, during the Israeli bombing of Gaza, there was a lot of energy around this issue, but it fizzled out in a month, maybe less. How do you recommend capturing the energy and turning it into long-term goals? What strategies do you recommend for organizing around more spontaneous events like those?
Yeah, I think that I wouldn't actually say that it fizzled. I think what happened is that people got organized and are working on long-term campaigns now. And that's kind of like it goes under the radar when you're really working on a long-term campaign. I'm just thinking about like we had a teachers union here in Portland that endorsed BDS like right away when this happened, which was so exciting and amazing. And now they've like gone quiet, and it's not because they're not going to do anything. It's because they're planning to like take it to the state level, and that kind of stuff takes time. Um, so I would say these sort of spontaneous events are really good for education and awareness building. And that's when you pull people in. And then you start planning for your long-term campaigns. So I think I wouldn't say that it's fizzled at all. I've seen the opposite, really. I saw a lot of interest and like awareness raising from people who didn't know that this was happening or didn't know much about Israel or Palestine. And they are getting involved in building these long-term campaigns now. That's what I've seen, which is really exciting.
Yeah, and I want to say also, I just heard that out of the spring, a new student group at Penn here in Philly formed called Penn Against the Occupation, which is great, which is really fantastic. My understanding is that student organizing has really struggled because of the pandemic, and people are coming back in person for the first time, and it's just been very disorienting for student organizing to pick up again. But the one exception to that has been the way that this spring really galvanized Palestine organizing at Penn, which is really cool to see for us here locally. So Mike has a question. Are there efforts to coordinate or share wisdom amongst people organizing within their union for BDS? Which is a great question.
Yes. I've been part of this group that has been working on like creating a sort of hub for people who want to organize within their union for BDS. We're actually planning like a speaker series to hear from people who have successfully passed BDS resolutions or done some sort of action in solidarity with Palestine in their unions for later this year. So if you are interested in that, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'm going to put my email in the chat for anything. If you have questions about anything, you can feel free to email me. But yeah, these conversations are definitely happening, and I think it's definitely needed as we see more union support.
Olivia, is this like a speakers bureau that's like going to be going to different cities, or?
No, it's going to be virtual.
Okay. Still really, really significant.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any other questions people have, or not even just, questions? If you have also experiences, you might want to chat in, just lessons that you have picked up.
And I would also love to hear like if there's BDS organizing happening in Philly, like you want to share about that?
Okay. Ron asks, what are information security practices that we can adopt when dealing with Canary Mission? For people who are not aware, Canary Mission is like this sort of like blacklist of Palestine organizers that has is directly funded and organized actually from Israel to disrupt student organizers, SJPs, to harass them. And they usually just pick up, it's like KeyWiki, but very geared towards Palestine in particular, and takes it to the next level so that not only does it end up coming up as the first Google search when an employer looks you up maybe, but they've actively also called up, in some cases, employers and grad schools to harass and talk about the student that they're targeting and to get the student or person fired. So yeah, back to the question of how would you deal with Canary Mission?
Yeah, I'm like the wrong person to ask this question because I'm so like bad at bad at InfoSec. Like my strategy has always just been to be like loud and unapologetic. And I feel like that actually keeps me safer because like, I don't know, I feel like I'm just like sending a message that I don't have anything to hide. And that kind of like, I mean, I'm on Canary Mission, but like, I think that when you go to Canary Mission, you can see pretty clearly what's happening. Like it's all like Muslims, Arabs, Jews, like it's like this is racist.
Black organizers, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's really racist and just smearing people as terrorists, and it looks insane. I would hope that like people see it for what it is. But I will say, like, I know people that organize with like they use a pseudonym, they don't use their real name, don't go on camera, don't post for pictures, that kind of thing. I think if you're concerned um, about getting on there, I would say, yeah, use a different name. But you know, I guess I have the privilege of saying that because I work for the BDS movement. Like I'm not going to get fired. But there were times when you know, I worked for a nonprofit here in Portland. I coach in Portland, and like just being really open about what I do and what I advocate for, I feel like has protected me. Being open with my employers that like, you know, I'm Arab. I care about the Palestinian cause. These people are psychos. Like, just so you know, they might like people did call my employer one time. So just like being really open about it has been what has protected me, I think.
Yeah, when you start to look at the website, you're like, there are a lot of people on here. It becomes this, the more there are, the more you're like, oh, these are kind of all my comrades, but also it makes less sense as you see all of these faces and people. And there's a lot of like Twitter joking about how like they haven't updated the pictures they've got in there. They like I think Olivia joked about like they picked the most flattering picture you got.
They picked such an ugly picture of me. They said that I like organized with SJP. I was at the like none of it's true. It's just like I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a little silly.
Humor and solidarity can
Yeah.
kind of get through. Matilda asks, you know, the three BDS goals broken down is really powerful. How can campaigns truly center Palestinian life and dignity while also utilizing more political or economical tactics?
That's a good question. I mean, I would say like I mentioned, the BDS call is a call from Palestinians. Like this is what Palestinians are asking us to do. So in that way, BDS like very much does center Palestinian life and dignity because we are answering this call from Palestinian civil society. I think something like 90% of Palestinians support BDS. So, you know, the very least we can do is to end our own complicity in Israeli violence. And I think, yeah, this is a call from Palestine, and we need to answer it.
And we still have enough time if people want to get their questions in. We will probably go a little bit past 2, depending on how things go. I guess I would, while we wait, I want to ask Olivia what your thoughts are. So Jamal Bowman was endorsed by I was going to go there. I was going to wait, but might as well. Was endorsed by National DSA, and we've worked with him around the Green New Deal for public schools. Recently, he not only voted yes on additional Iron Dome funding. The Iron Dome funding that in Congress was an additional $1 billion on top of the $3 billion that Israel gets anyway, and really was about recouping the losses that Israel experienced during its invasion of Gaza this spring. And it's important to say during the spring as well, there was a Palestinian strike, a general strike that happened that also did incur costs on Israel. And so just to be very clear that mass organizing of Palestinians is what they're trying to recoup their losses for. And this is where our money is also going on top of that. So Jamal Bowman not only voted for that, but has also gone to Israel on a delegation, a congressional delegation sponsored by J Street. So what are your thoughts about how we can hold, candidates like Bowman accountable, and how we go forward in DSA in terms of like relating to and really centering Palestinians, saying it's actually very strategically critical for us to take this up and push them on this?
Yeah, well, first I want to say I'm just speaking as an individual now, not on behalf of the working group or the BDS movement or anything, but my personal view on this Jamal Bowman controversy is, I think it's really embarrassing that we as an organization support BDS, and yet we have an elected official who posed with the Israeli prime minister in Israel 2 days ago. Like, that's embarrassing for our organization. I think it speaks to a larger problem we have in DSA of how to hold candidates accountable to our positions as an organization, because we don't really have a mechanism for that right now. And maybe some chapters do. But I think, I see DSA as a pre-party organization. And I think we need to start acting like it. And I don't think that we should I think we need to hold elected officials to a higher standard than just general members. Like, obviously, general members are free to disagree with positions we've taken as an organization. But if you are an elected official representing DSA, endorsed by DSA, I think that you need to uphold our principles. And if you don't, there should be consequences, whether it's censure, which censure doesn't really mean anything for DSA right now. Like, what does that mean? Like, if we were a party, for example, they would, if we were censuring them, they would lose their right to vote within the party or stuff like that. But we don't have, censure doesn't mean anything for DSA right now, is my understanding. So it's my view that we should expel Bowman. Or if, I actually don't even know if he's a member or if we just endorsed him, and definitely not endorse him again. I don't think it's worth it. I think it's very embarrassing. I don't think that just putting our name on a candidate gives us any power at all. Just having, a relationship with a staffer in a congressional office, like, we can do that without putting our name on a candidate. So I just, it's really embarrassing for the organization. And I really think that we need to have some sort of standardized process so that this doesn't happen again. I think we've done a really good job with candidates like Zahran Mamdani, for example, who came out of DSA organizing and then run for office, rather than having this sort of I don't even know what our relationship to Bowman is. I would assume that he was not active in DSA before getting the endorsement. And I really think that we need to create a culture of recruiting from within our ranks to run candidates, rather than looking for external candidates to put our name on.
Yeah, I think Zahran, I think Corey, I think Rashida has been, also because she has a relationship to Detroit DSA, I think it is really indicative of the relationships people have on the ground too. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, Raya says, thanks so much for this great talk. I'm part of the Anti-Militarism Working Group of Science for the People. We love it. It's been feeling out a coalition effort of STEM for Palestine. There are folks here who work or study in STEM and would like to tap into that frame for this work. Raya's, thank you, Raya. I hope that's how you pronounce your name. That sounds great. Are you in Philly? That would be also great to connect with you. And awesome, yes. Yeah, and it sounds like this is also very much connected to Olivia. They were organizing around NSO in Oregon. So I think tech radicals and tech organizing right now is really a critical place for targeting Israeli sort of surveillance efforts too.
Yeah, I just want to plug, there's a campaign No Tech for Apartheid, which is targeting Google and Amazon's cloud contract with Israel, and it's being led by workers at Google and Amazon, which is amazing. I think they have like 1,200 workers now signed on to it. So I think that's a really exciting opportunity for tech campaigning.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, just Amazon, Facebook, all the Google organizing that's been happening is just is so critical for us. And Cooper says, thank you, Olivia. I think it's important to recognize how powerful the Democratic Party apparatus is in disciplining its members. Yeah, and if there are any other folks who want to get connected, Olivia is also part of national organizing. We here in PhillyDSA are part of local organizing, and having discussions about potentially kicking off a campaign soon. So this is definitely, please plug in. I will give sort of like a last round if people have any additional comments or questions before we close out. And I want to just plug that if you are not a member of PhillyDSA, you totally should be, and you should get involved. We have some organizing right now that absolutely aligns with everything that we're talking about here. We have electoral campaigns kicking off soon that, we are also centering BDS around in our platform and in who we choose to represent DSA. We have a campaign around, we own PGW, Philadelphia Gas Works, and eco-socialist organizing as well. Ryan Mosgrove talks about, Metro DCA, DSA, the DC is organizing around BDS as well. And if you are already a member, but still trying to figure out how you really want to plug in, we also have a new members meeting happening tomorrow that you should definitely check out. I'm just gonna put that in there as well. You can RSVP. I have one question in the DM. I come from an immigrant South Indian Christian community. What are the particular lessons BDS movement has learned in organizing with non-Palestinian immigrant communities in the US? It's a really great question.
That is a good question. I think it just speaks to, there's a lot of support for Palestine among immigrant communities for sure. And I think it's also really important when we do BDS campaigns to link our struggles. And so actually AFSC, which is the American Friends Service Committee, they have an amazing database that has a bunch of different companies, and they focus on borders and occupations. And it really shows, I'm going to link it in the chat because it's a really great resource if you're doing BDS campaigns to like look at these companies. It really shows like the way that mass incarceration, immigrant detention, and military occupation are all linked. And I think it's been really helpful to make these links when campaigning, especially in the US, like Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli military company. They surveil the US-Mexico border. And so there's just G4S does transportation of immigrants that are being deported. And I think there's just so many links to make. And yeah, it's really powerful when we are able to make those links because these issues really are connected.
Yeah, okay. I have one, I think, possible question maybe from Sean. And I also just want to make a quick plug for a couple of other links. One is the Palestine National Working Group is really active and is a good place for you to connect with other chapters doing work. I'm going to put that link in the chat as well. And on a local level, we have our night school coming up on mass incarceration this coming week for Philly. So if you want to get on that, it's in the chat. Awesome. Tim says there's another working group in Minnesota, which is excellent because it's like the center of like not only the George Floyd protests, but the Line 3 protests. And it sounds like just a really good time to have that all together. Sean, did you want to ask your question? And I think maybe we'll kind of close out with that.
Yeah. So Olivia, thank you so much for being here. This has been such an informative and exciting last hour and change. So really appreciate your time. I wanted to mention both for everyone in the room, if anyone has any affiliation with Thomas Jefferson University, there's some like early kind of convening of a couple of interested TJU community members around starting a BDS campaign there. So there's some like really clear direct links. And so I'm going to put my email in the chat if anyone is like affiliated with TJU and wants to kind of learn more or get involved. But I wanted to ask Olivia, so I'm a grad student currently, but I will not be as of May 2022. And I guess maybe if you have any like wisdom or thoughts or experience anecdotes about academic campaigns where, you know, people are still kind of involved after they're like no longer students or no longer kind of in the institution, and how that may work, and how, you know, we're still in really early stage, like how can I like best be, and others who may, you know, leave the institution in you know, less than a year, how can we still support you know, whatever organizing is still going on, and make sure that it stays in, you know, ongoing for the long haul until there's a win.
Yeah, I think, you know, that is a problem that just always occurs in terms of campus organizing. Is people graduate, they leave, and that institutional memory is lost. So I think it's a really important role for you to have, like, once you are done, that you stay on and like help see this through, like forming like an advisory committee maybe of people who are graduated but are sticking around to see the campaign through, I think is like really important to campus organizing and academic organizing because of that institutional memory that's needed. So yeah, I would say like form like an advisory committee of people who are like committed to stay around for the long haul.
Thanks, Olivia. That's so exciting. So if you have any leads for Sean, also get in touch. And I think that's basically concludes our teach-in for today. Thank you so much, Olivia. This was, I feel like, a really rich, expansive conversation. And it's, yeah, really exciting to see how much more work we can do as DSA. So with that, please join DSA, please get plugged in, and hopefully we'll see you at another chapter meeting.